contract mean? Contract means you have the idea, but you are not going to do the manufacturing yourself. You're going to hire another manufacturing company to actually create the product. You could even involve them in the design. You can involve them in the shipping. There's a lot of there's some flexibility in your ability to grow their scope or shrink their scope based on what you're able to do. You still retain all the intellectual property, and typically you're responsible for the sales and customer interaction. It's useful if you need to scale up quickly and you don't have the space, the tools, the labor, right? So there are some pros that we'll talk about. And sometimes it just makes more sense financially to mass produce somewhere else. Typically, when you're dealing in bulk quantities, you're not doing one-offs or very low volume custom stuff. But when you're producing bulk widgets, bulk product, and for a startup, when you don't have the resources to stand up your own manufacturing process. Next slide. So what are the potential costs? You have higher level legal fees because you're dealing with the contract entity. And so you really need to protect your intellectual property, but also you need to set the contract for expectations and boundaries. We call this a contract manufacturing agreement. So everything is going to be in that contract when things go right and when things go wrong, especially when things go wrong. What's going to happen? How do you rectify it? How do you escalate it if there's disagreement? All that really needs to be set up front. And so your legal fees are going to be higher. Your research and development, there's still potential costs. You're going to have to pay them to create those initial prototypes, and you're not going to sell them. So that's kind of the same, like in-house. And then you have your manufacturing fees. The way it usually works is you pay them for their cost plus their additional fees. So like David had mentioned in the beginning, your price per product is going to be more than if you were to manufacture that in-house, because you're covering their costs plus their additional fee. And then your profit is whatever's left over from that. And then travel fees, typically, unless you found a manufacturing down the street, you're going to have to visit because you're going to want to validate and see firsthand what their process is, what their QC is like. And obviously you're going to potentially want to meet and greet before you enter into a manufacturing agreement. Next slide. So what's that process? You still have to determine what are you going to sell? What are you actually building? But now you really have to describe that through documentation. Obviously in-house, you might do that as well, but you're taking more time to make sure, because someone else is reading these that you might not have direct interaction with. You're going to find the appropriate manufacturer. There's a lot. There's here, in state, there's in nation, there's overseas. So a lot of options. So you're doing that work to find the manufacturer that fits your requirements. You're entering into that agreement. You're setting up the non-disclosure agreement so that they're not going to steal your intellectual property. And you're still responsible for, the design, but they are, responsible for all the elements of the production. You're talking about how many products are delivered in what time frame. How do you terminate that contract? You're dealing with all of that with your selected manufacturing organization, and they'll probably be back and forth, right, until you settle on terms. They'll start manufacturing, and then you figure out what that feedback loop looks like. You're not there on site to see firsthand, and how do you actually implement changes? Like you don't like how something's happening, so they're responsible for figuring out how they're going to adjust, and then you're responsible. That might result in fee changes, escalation of costs. Ultimately, again, you're responsible for the product and the customer satisfaction. Next slide. So what are the risks? Obviously, there's a very high risk for intellectual property to be leaked. Someone else now has access to your secret sauce. Yes, you have a manufacturing contract agreement, But Amazon will quickly show that a lot of people don't care. Amazon is full of knockoffs now that have flooded the market, and so they're stealing people's intellectual property. And a lot of times, it's hard to go after, especially if you are contract manufacturing overseas. There's maritime law, but who knows what the course of action is. So that's just a huge risk, and a huge cost to pursue that legal course of action. You're kind of at the mercy of another entity. Now that might be good, but that might be bad as well, because you're subject to their delays. You really don't have direct control. You're just another contract to them. You still are subject to all the typical manufacturing issues that cause delays. It's just not your responsibility to resolve it, but you're still directly impacted by it. And then you don't have direct input and insight into their process like you would if it's in-house. There's a delay and able to pivot. You're not there, and it takes time because they have other obligations, or maybe you're one of 20 products that are on this assembly line, and so you can't pivot a design if it's different from all the other things that they're working on. And then quality control is a little bit more of an issue because you're not there on site. And obviously, you're not, liability increases because, they might be shipping things and you're not there to manage the QC. Next slide. So what are the pros? There's less upfront costs because someone else is doing the manufacturing for you. They're responsible to source the goods and the equipment, and ideally they already are set up for that, right? They're already set up to produce what you want to produce, and that's why you're going to contract with them. You're not dealing with staffing, so there's left overhead costs, and all those related issues. And then it's a faster spin up time. Again, you're not having to buy and do all this purchasing and worrying about labor, so you're able to spin up because ideally there's someone already doing the work, and it's just getting into a contract with them, and you're able to realize profits sooner. Smaller margin of profit, but sooner revenue. Allows you to expand and grow output faster. You don't have to buy additional equipment, hire additional people. You rely on them to scale, and typically they have the means to scale because you're not the only one that they're doing manufacturing for. And then so you minimize risk because you're not dealing with equipment failure and dealing with labor issues, and so you're kind of reducing the risk. It provides more consistent financials with known profit margins. You're entering into a contract agreement. They're responsible to produce a certain amount by a certain time. You know what you're going to sell it for. You know what their cost is. So you're able to kind of predict more your profit margins. And usually they have more technical expertise. They're experts in manufacturing. And so you're able to leverage their knowledge and their experience and their input. What are the cons? Obviously, you're putting your product in the hands of someone else, and nobody cares more about your product than you. You are client 1, 4, 6, 7, 8, right? And not to say that they won't care about your product, but they're never going to have the same ownership that you have. So when it comes to excellence and output and quality, that's kind of a con. And then obviously, your intellectual properties could be leaked, could be copied, could be stolen, right? There's greater production cost just because you're paying for their cost plus profit. So it's easier to spin up and you realize revenue, but over the long term, you're going to end up paying more over the long term. Again, let me make that clear. It's cheaper probably to stand up quickly with contract manufacturing, but over the long term, it's going to cost you more. Little to no control over their manufacturing process. Again, why are they going to change? They have other clients, or they've probably been doing this way. So your cost savings, you might not be able to realize them. And then like a long lead time, the resolution with issues you may have.